100% of Americans to fight our far-flung battles. And by the way, we are now, according to Nick Turse, dogged and relentless reporter, we've had special commando operations in the last year in 133 countries. I mean, we know nothing really about the nature of those, those interventions, what we're actually doing, because they're secret. But the Pentagon does admit that we've been in that many countries in small groups. That's 70% of the globe's countries. So I mean, anyway, it goes on. And I think the vets are being manipulated to support that because the whole idea is whatever you think of foreign policy, we should support the vets. But I think the effect of that is it's used really as a club to quiet and really try to crush dissent. So just one point on that, I think we shouldn't. Instead of saying thank you for your service, we should talk to vets because I think that bridge between the civilian world and the military one is a dangerous one and serves the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But I think instead we need to say
goodbye.
Hey, thank you. Not thank you for your service, but will you tell me about your service? Because I think we have something to learn from veterans, and it might lead to a couple hours of very disturbing conversation. Because in my experience, and I've talked to hundreds of veterans over the years, once you get talking to them, almost completely apart from their politics, and I've talked to some very right-wing vets. If you actually ask them about their experience, they're as eloquent as anybody at laying out the gross disparity between the way the war is described by political and military officials and the way it is actually lived. So, with that, though, I want to try to broaden it with a few examples. I don't want to go on too long, by the way, because I want to hear from you. But I want to read a few passages just to give you a sense of some of the detail of the book and some of its content. But I want to broaden out this idea that we were the key victims. How it is that we came to see ourselves as victims after having waged this most aggressive of all wars. I would say I'm not going to go too much into the war, but I can't help but say this because I have a chapter called "The American Way of War." I really try to lay out just how aggressive our warfare was. And at the beginning of it, I decided to write about B-52 bombers. And my thought was that most Americans, if they have an image of the Vietnam War, one of the images they have is of a lot of helicopters, which is true. I mean, in many ways it was a helicopter war. There were thousands of helicopters of all different kinds. And if you pick up most books about the Vietnam War, there's almost always a helicopter. In fact, I said last night that Viking sent me an initial copy of the cover, and it was one of these generic pictures of helicopters. And I wrote back, you gotta be kidding me. This is I cannot live with this cover. I'm sorry. I had an easy argument because it took me all of 3 minutes on Amazon to find another book that had the same exact. I knew it was cheap too. The public domain that never paid a cent. So I wrote that out and I said, listen, we got to have something that really shows, the destruction that they're doing in Vietnam. So I think this was a wise choice. Oddly enough, if you have the book, it shows a napalm explosion on the village of Trong Bon in 1972 with a row of mostly journalists watching it, kind of aghast. One guy has his hands over his head, which I think is a pretty good sort of representation of what we're trying to get across. But a few minutes later, after this photograph was taken, the famous photograph of Kim Phuc, the 9-year-old girl who comes running out of that village naked and burning from napalm. I didn't want to use that because for a variety of different reasons, I think it's too much in your face, and almost because it's been used so much, I don't know if it would have the impact. As an aside, one of the ways the war has been repackaged is that all those famous images of the war that we are all familiar with, the Buddhist monk self-immolating, the Saigon, the chief of the National South Vietnamese Police with the bullet to the head, pistol to the head execution during the Tet Offensive, pictures from the My Lai massacre, the Kent State photograph. I mean, those are the 4 or 5 most iconic images of the war, certainly at the time. It's worth noting, there's a study done of high school textbooks from the end of the war and through the 80s, and all of those pictures fell out of the textbooks. With almost, very few exceptions. They were just not there. But what's interesting is, of course, students often knew of those pictures from other sources. Obviously, they get most of their information from places besides history textbooks, and that's a good thing. I mean, actually, an album called Rage